Bloody hell. What are you doing, lad? Gods, I didn't hear you coming. Well, I'm silent as a hawk. Well, I was rowing. Rowing? Give it to you, lad. Let the expert teach you. Alright. You silly lad. Yes, this is what I'm talking about. Rowing. Oh, alright, nice, very nice. Hey, what's that? What? I didn't see anything. One, two, rowing! Right, so you keep doing it, keep rowing. I'm all sweaty. I need to take a bath and then I'm going to make a video. Well, see you, mate. Oh, good God, I'm too old for this.
Hello, my dear friends. How are you? My name is Arthur and today I'm going to talk about ship burials in the Scandinavian archaeological context and a possible connection to the cult of the Vanir tribe of gods. On the previous video, I have made a little introduction to the importance of ships in old Scandinavian societies, and I gave you a few examples of Viking ships. Ships were very important to the Norse due to geographical reasons which influenced the Norse communities. They were the fastest means of communication, transportation, trade, the key to a thriving fishing economy, and of course precisely what gave the Norse peoples advantage in conflicts against their enemies. During medieval Europe, Vikings were responsible for a tremendous breakthrough in maritime technology and the art of navigation. Ships and everything that came along with them became an icon in the Norse cultures, so much that even after death, the ship iconography spread all over Scandinavia and ships were buried with the dead. Served as tombs or even burial mounds started to be built in the shape of ships, stones arranged in the form of a deck of a ship. Now, before the conversion to Christianity, the heathen peoples of Scandinavia practiced different forms of burial of the dead. With the advent of Christianity, for archaeologists, Scandinavian burials lost a bit of sense of wonder and fun because with Christianity there was a minimalist approach introduced by the church. It became the custom to bury the dead shrouded with a simple sheet, because the earthly things were of little relevance in the next life. What a fun way to go. But to the Scandinavian heathens, things were quite different. They would send their dead to the next life fully dressed, with personal adornments, accompanied by items of daily life and of their trade, and even with animals and other people as sacrifices. The next world was imagined very much like this one, so people had to be prepared for a life after death. But some burials had a more symbolic function than others. Burials with boats, which might indicate a journey to the next life by means of navigation. Sometimes all ships were used, sometimes the ship was represented symbolically by a boat-shaped stone setting, or sometimes only parts of the ship were used. Boats became a widespread phenomenon in Scandinavian due to their importance in the culture itself. But boats, ships, were not just to take the dead into the other side. Both burial customs and grave goods indicate the social status of the dead. Not everyone had the luxury to have a ship-themed funeral. Only people with high social status or of great importance in the Norse societies. Only kings, jarls, local chieftains, very successful merchants could own a boat. People with high social status, power and wealth, and such power and wealth could be extended to their family members, of course. It's not only to send the dead in a journey by boat, creating such a romantic scenario, a funeral drama scene. Honestly, ship burials had the intention to show the high social status of the person being buried there, wealthy enough to pay for a magnificent funeral and a burial mound on top of it, which would last ages, becoming a landmark not only to show the domains of the property, but also a proof to the descendants of the deceased that that property belonged to them. After all, their wealthy ancestors were buried there, and those burial mounds belong to them. But aside from showing off wealth, power, high status, of course, spiritual and religious importance was implicit in these burials. It became clear that the ship iconography occupied an important role in various rituals reaching far back in the history of Scandinavia. Their widespread occurrence suggests a deep-rooted connection to the spiritual sphere, even if the reason and meaning behind such burials might have changed in time. During prehistoric and medieval times of Scandinavia, the boat was an indispensable object in everyday life. When something becomes so important in a society, multifunction, and people depend upon it, it's just comprehensible the need to maintain the contact with that even after death. And Scandinavian pagan traditions are very much connected to objects and their power and meaning. I'm sorry. Spiritually speaking, and with a pagan worldview of the spiritual itself, when people created something, they infused it with power. Their own power and essence, the act of creating, bending the mind and will to create something, and this infused the object with the power, the energy of the person. And of course, the very purpose of the object gave it power. This is one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why people gave objects to the gods as offerings. It was giving the gods the very essence of the person, and the gods in return were obliged to give something in return. An exchange of gifts, exchange of power, force, energy, the Migin. Often such objects were broken and offered to the gods just like that, shattered, bent, damaged, precisely to release the force in it. This was a common belief in many pagan societies. Now, an entire ship, or even parts of it, something so important in a culture, multifunctioning, linked to war, trade, communication, the great booster of Scandinavian economy, was certainly a mighty gift one could take to the other side. Burning the ship, breaking it, disabling it, it releases the power in it. I'm sorry for coughing back there, but I'm still quite ill. It's my lungs. Anyway, in many ancient cultures, animal sacrifices linked to burials were very common, and one of the most sacrificed animals was the horse, which symbolically was another multifunctioning thing, linked to nobility, a means of rapid transportation, consumption, war, a variety of shamanic connections to the animal, its magnificence, etc. But in Scandinavia, as I've said in the previous video, due to the diverse geography, natural barriers, a very uneven relief, the boat was the best means of communication, transport, trading, and a means of sustenance, because the sea had plenty to give, since agriculture was scarce in Scandinavia, especially in Norway, and in most places it was just impossible to farm. Boats, ships almost became the equivalent of horses. It was also a sacrifice in burial contexts. And there were loads of ships constructed only with the objective, the purpose of burying them, built as offerings, not with the purpose of using them in navigation. Well, not navigating on this world anyway. And of course, speaking of animal sacrifices, I think it's important to say this. There are hundreds of reasons why animals accompanied the dead. Fertility cults, connection to the social status of the person, link to specific deities, spiritual and shamanic functions to communicate with a specific deity, infuse the dead with the attributes of the animal being the means of transportation into the other side, or simply the pets of the person, etc. And such animal sacrifices often were not of the entire animal. Specific parts, not only for practical magical reasons, each body part for specific magical work, but also as an indicator of the animal presence. This also happens with objects and of course boats. Parts of boats, ships, to indicate the connection that person had with boat building, sailing, fishing, economy, trading, etc. There are cases of only boat rivets and nails were buried with the person to indicate the connection the person had with boats somehow. Maybe because the deceased was a boat builder, the smith who played an important role by creating the metal parts of the ship, or maybe simply because his descendants had the necessity to continue to use the boat for their trade, and symbolically they would put in the grave the representation of ships, so the person might come before the gods and show them what the person was in life. A more or less good example of that is when people were sacrificed with wolves, to show the gods, especially to Odin, that they were criminals, outlaws, murderers, etc. People not worthy to enter Valhalla, for instance. And the gods knew that because of the presence of the wolf or wolf parts. Well, this is just an example to reinforce the fact that objects, even parts of them, were an indication of the social status of the person without having to put in the burial the entire thing. If ships were so important in the Scandinavian society, they were certainly linked to the divine. All these cults, offerings, the entire purpose of creating ships just to house the dead, certainly there was a cult to specific deities connected to ships. Well, yes and no and perhaps. There certainly was a cult behind boat building for ritual purposes connected with the dead. But it's very hard to say if indeed boat building in itself was really connected to the cult of specific deities. There has been this discussion for some time amongst academics, the connection between boat graves, burial mounds in the shape of ships, well, this entire funeral practice related with boats, and a connection with a cult of the Vanir tribe of gods. It makes sense in a way. Alright, nothing is as simple as it appears to be. Nothing can be easily explained with a couple of arguments just because we have the predisposition to create patterns. And in archaeology, there is still the tendency to compare what is found with historical sources, which most of the time are wrong. Just because we find a 8-legged horse represented in a stone doesn't mean it's Sleipnir, Odin's horse. Or just because we find the representation of a serpent underneath a boat doesn't mean it's the story of the world serpent Jormungandr and Thor trying to fish it out of the sea. Sometimes those seem to be the simplest explanations, but there is a multitude of personal meanings which made people create a variety of things, and we might never know what led them to do such things. Now, talking about the Vanir and their possible connection with boats and ship burials. As I've said, the ship motif is a very widespread phenomenon in archaeology for Northern Europe. There are numerous ship images on runestones, ornamental objects and coins, but what really catches the eye is the connection of boats with burials. Hundreds of burials with real boats deposited in graves, but also many stone ships, burial sites with lines of stones erected in the shape of a boat. So, the first thing we can do is trying to find in the mythological accounts something related to this. It's the first step almost unconsciously. Trying to find comparisons which may not exist at all because our ancestors had other intentions that had nothing to do with the stories of the gods. But if the ship in burials has the intention to carry the dead into the other side, if we take a look at the myths, there is absolutely no reference of boats carrying the dead into the afterlife. And in the Viking Age, the concept of Valhalla gained tremendous proportions, and Odin became one of the most worshipped deities during the Viking Age. Even so, both Valhalla and Odin have no connection to boats. So we have to turn to other gods. Clearly, the Aesir have no connection to ships. Only Baldur, who was burnt in a ship, but that's the funeral custom right there, not the explanation of that funeral custom in the first place. So we have to turn to the Vanir for some explanations. So let's try to connect the ship motif with the Vanir to see if we can come up with another reason behind boats and burials. Another reason other than the average idea of the boat being the vehicle to take the dead into the afterlife. There is no dispute the Vanir gods do have associations with seafaring. The god Njordr, god of the sea, of fishermen, boats, fertility, prosperity and wealth, lives in Nualthon, the enclosure of ships. He was called upon to calm the winds for seafaring and fishing. He clearly is associated with ships, and this association moves on to his own children, Freyr and Freya. Well, Freya is known by many names, and one of which is Mardo, the first element of the name being the sea. Freyr owns a great ship called Skindblandir, the best of ships. So it seems we may connect ship burials with a Vanir cult. Perhaps. But there is a problem, a tiny detail. Ship burials are for the dead, clearly related to death, obviously. And Freyr might be connected to ships, but he isn't connected to death. And nowhere in the description of his ship mentions anything related to death. The only Vanir god related to death and the afterlife is not a god at all. It's a goddess, Freya. She has her home in Folkevangr, which is described as being one heaven, one specific part of the afterlife. Whenever she rides to battle, she takes half of the slain, the other half go to Odin. Now, Folkevangr. Vangr in Old Norse means field, mostly used in place names and in poetry, which includes words such as Vangar, the fields of heaven or of the sky, with a connection with the afterlife. Vangr seems to have a connection with heaven, with the afterlife, paradise, whatever. Old English Norsvang and Gothic Vangs both mean paradise. The point is, it seems the Old Norse word Vangr had some sort of sacred connection to the afterlife. Unfortunately, nothing of this concerning Freya mentions anything about boats. Right, now you are probably saying, oh gods, so are the Vanir connected to ship burials or not? Well, quite possible, yes. Freya's hull in Folkevangr is called Sysrumnir, and Sysrumnir is one of the ships in a list of names for ships. In certain accounts, there are lists of ships such as Frey's ship Skindblandir, Naglfari or Naglfar, the boat made entirely of the nails of the dead, which will bring the enemies of the gods to their shores during Ragnarok, and Sysrumnir is counted as a ship in that list. So it may be that Freya's hull is in fact a ship, or at least in an early stage of Norse paganism it was a ship. And of course we have to take in mind many of Old Norse structures, especially the Great Hull, resembled a ship upside down. And in ship burial, the boats and ships were usually turned upside down to cover the deceased, and it seems likely that they could have functioned as some sort of coffin or container, or to resemble a dwelling, a typical Norse dwelling, or a miniature of a great hull for the deceased. And if Folkevangr is a field and Sysrumnir is a ship, it's a ship which has a function of a hull, and it's in that field, resembling the stone burials in the form of ships, a house, a hull, in that specific spot. And if we remember that the god Frey's burial mound mentioned in the Hinglinga saga the burial mound of the god gave peace, good seasons and prosperity in the land. So maybe Freya's ship Systrumnir had the same function, to give some sort of beneficial power to the place where it stands. Thus, the creation of stone burials in the form of ships and ships buried in the ground, as a symbolic representation of Freya's hull, probably to give the place in which such burials were inserted some sort of power, beneficial effects, in an early stage of pre-Christian pagan beliefs, a purpose which at some point might have been forgotten, but the practice continued because it became a tradition. So, it's quite possible that, at least to prehistoric Scandinavians, graves in the shape of boats had the symbolic function of resembling Freya's hull, Systrumnir, a death cult related to the goddess, because Odin, as a god related to death and who takes warriors, came much later into Scandinavian religious beliefs. So Freya for centuries was the only deity related to death, the afterlife and ships. This is not so far-fetched as you may think, because afterlife beliefs, including afterlife places involving strong nautical elements, have been identified in numerous Indo-European cultures. Alright my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Did I sound like one of those History Channel historians who have just found a connection between aliens and the pyramids? Well, maybe a little. Suffice it to say that different meanings or symbolic functions have been assigned to ships. It's clear that they can either be a symbolic representation of the journey to the afterlife, and they can also be considered an expression of the Old Norse people's connection to the sea in a social, political, economic and religious sense. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag!